You're watching Beyond 100 Days. A British Navy ship comes dangerously close to contact with Iranian boats in the Strait of Hormuz.
HMS Montrose trains its guns on vessels believed to belong to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
The UK frigate was escorting an oil tanker through the dangerous waters when it was intercepted by the Iranian boats. Thousands of illegal immigrants could be rounded up for deportation from America this weekend after President Trump calls for high-profile raids.
Also on the programme, the White House is holding a social media summit today to discuss the future of tech, but no invite for Facebook, Twitter and Google. And ringing the bell for Big Ben, 160 years since it first struck the hour, we'll take a look back at the history of one of Britain's most enduring monuments.
Hello, I'm Catty Kay with Christian Fraser here in London. The Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf has become so tense recently that oil tankers now need a military escort. Today, one of those naval escorts came dangerously close to Iranian vessels. The British Navy's HMS Montrose was forced to train its guns on 3 Iranian boats that were impeding the progress of a British oil tanker.
The Ministry of Defence says the boats, believed to belong to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, tried to stop the tanker as it moved into the Straits. Iran had warned there would be repercussions over the UK's seizure of an Iranian oil tanker off the coast of Gibraltar last week. The British Foreign Secretary says the UK is doing all it can to keep its ships safe.
Obviously very concerning developments, but also I'm very proud of the Royal Navy and the role that they played in keeping British assets, British shipping safe. We are continuing to monitor the situation very, very carefully. We are constantly monitoring the security and constantly keeping under review the kind of security that we need to keep British shipping safe.
OK, let's talk to Hagar Shamali. She's the former spokesperson for the US at the United Nations. There have been times in the past when oil tankers needed escorts during the Iran-Iraq war. How much of an indication is it that we're heading to a time of tension, potentially conflict, that we're back in that situation now?
Well, times are certainly tense. It's not unprecedented, though, for the United States to offer, and for other governments to offer, military escort for those vessels. Certainly those waters and that point is a very strategic one. 1/3 of the world's oil goes through there. That's seaborne oil, and 20% of the world's oil is transited through that section. So it's definitely a critical part, but that doesn't mean that we're close to inching to war, and certainly nothing that indicates an all-out military escalation.
So what is Iran trying to achieve then? What are they trying to do by goading the UK, by goading the Brits, the British Navy like this?
At the end of the day, what Iran is trying to achieve is leverage in order not to create a crisis, but to give themselves a bit more pressure for ultimate negotiations, right? So what they want at the end of the day is sanctions relief and economic concessions from the UK and the EU without soliciting a kind of military response and without soliciting sanctions on the other end. But they're not going about it the right way at all. At the end of the day, the action that the Iranians are taking in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf is completely different than what the British did off the coast of Gibraltar.
But I suppose, Hagar, they would see this as the only way they can operate. They're operating essentially in a grey zone. It's not war, it's not peace. And it reminds the rest of the world that the Trump actions have implications for everybody else.
Of course. I mean, that is to be expected. Both sides, actually, both President Trump and the Iranians, what they're trying to do, and the bottom line is that they're both trying to get leverage for negotiations. The Iranians are trying to increase their leverage with these small, provocative steps so that when both sides come to the table, which one day they will, they'll have more leverage, right? So they're trying not to create a moderate nuclear crisis without soliciting a major response, right? Neither side wants war, and that's very clear. On the U.S. side, the reason they're trying to gain so much leverage is because they want negotiations for one day when they happen to include Iran's nefarious behavior in the region and probably its human rights abuses, not just its nuclear program. That's why the situation has been so tense. But surely it affects not just Europeans and those in the region, but really everybody. I mean, globally, it affects everybody.
Yeah, but it shows how difficult it is. Emmanuel Macron has got one of his high representatives over there in Tehran. They've been talking for 2 days. It seems the option is a freeze for freeze. So they freeze enriching uranium. Donald Trump freezes further sanctions. The difficulty is when you have things like this, it just continues to escalate.
That's right, but you know, it does. The pressure is going to continue up to a certain point, and both sides right now say that neither one wants to go to the table. Neither side is ready for diplomatic negotiations. But at the end of the day, what Iran wants is sanctions relief, and the only way they're going to get that is if they negotiate with the United States, and they're not going to get it by provocative military-style or mafia-style measures, and they're certainly not going to get it by trying to threaten to walk back from the Iran deal further. The only way they're going to be able to do it is to negotiate directly and to halt their activities. Let's remember that in 2014, it's sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table. I was at the Treasury Department at the time, and I worked on the Iran deal. And one of the things that was interesting that was done back then that could be done again is that certain sanctions related to Iranian trade were put on hold during negotiations. And so the same thing could happen. I'm not saying that the United States would walk them back, but there's potential to hold some of them while negotiations take place.
Okay, Hagan Washamali there, former spokesperson at the United Nations. Thanks very much for joining us. Well, Donald Trump has tweeted about this incident in the Gulf. It seems that the Brits and the French and the Germans are coming around to the idea that the Iranians are up to no good.
In 2001, Jack Straw was the first senior British government minister to visit Iran. He visited frequently in the 5 years that he was the Foreign Secretary. He's just written about the UK's turbulent relationship with Tehran. His book is called The English Job, Understanding Iran. And Mr. Straw is with us in the studio. Hello.
Hello.
If you want to negotiate with a country, you have to understand where they're coming from. Does the West understand Iran?
Many people in the West don't, and I'm afraid that applies to President Trump. And what Iran craves above all else is respect and recognition for its importance as a regional power and for its antiquity, 2,500 years of civilization before our civilization got going here in the UK. But just picking up on that report, I agree with your last interviewee that Iran is going about this the wrong way. Their economy is in absolutely dire straits because of the imposition of these further sanctions by President Trump. I mean, just to give you one example, before the sanctions were imposed, Iran was exporting 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. Now it's down to 400,000. And that has phenomenal implications for their ability to get hold of foreign exchange and for the domestic economy. So you've got shortages, rising prices, increasing unemployment and general discontent. What this illustrates, and what I try to bring out in my book, is that you've got a very, under an apparently homogenous system of government under the supreme leader, Khamenei, you've got different power centres. And at the moment, what's clear, and it's partly a consequence of Trump's sanctions, is that power has shifted from President Rouhani and people like Foreign Minister Zarif, the elected government, to the non-elected but very powerful Revolutionary Guards, and they're calling the shots. And they're not.
So, ironically, Donald Trump is in lockstep with the hardliners in a way.
Or at least giving the hardliners some kind of succor.
Well, he's given them succor. I mean, the irony of this is indeed directly in lockstep with them, because the Revolutionary Guards and other hardliners around Khamenei were always opposed to a nuclear deal. They were when, with my French and German counterparts, I was trying to negotiate a deal back when President Khatami was president, and they continued to be all the way through the Obama-Rouhani negotiations. And it took a lot of persuasion of Khamenei, the supreme leader, to go along with the deal. And he's made public statements now saying he regrets that. But it's a great irony that, because the Revolutionary Guards, they control about a third of the economy, they run smuggling operations, and they are immune from the consequences. The elite in Iran, including the Revolutionary Guards, are immune from the economic consequences of the sanctions. But your interviewee was right to say the only way through this is by negotiations, and it's getting from where we are now to there. That's the challenge.
I mean, another misstep it seems from the Iranian calculation point of view is that by doing what they have done today and coming that close to a British naval vessel, they're effectively splitting the Europeans away from them. I mean, they had the Europeans on side after the Americans pulled out of the nuclear agreement. So why would you then try and alienate the Brits? That doesn't seem to make sense.
You're absolutely right, Katie. Well, they're doing this because they're very upset about the detention of the Iranian tanker
off
in
Gibraltar.
Gibraltar.
Yeah.
But I mean, as I've explained to Iranian diplomats, I mean, that was under EU sanctions, and they knew that these sanctions existed. It was not about exporting oil to Iran. It was about exporting oil against EU sanctions to Syria. But just coming back to this issue of negotiations, there's no question that Donald Trump would like a deal with Iran, and the Iranian government privately are desperate for a deal. But you've got to get from where we are and get down through these egos, but also the declared public positions against negotiations. That requires incredibly careful preparation. It was 2 years of secret negotiations through Oman that occurred before the formal Obama-Rouhani negotiations with the EU took place leading up to the deal in 2015. One of the things I think very strongly is that and the British government perhaps could have an input here, if you want a deal, then it's got to be one that looks at new regional architecture and accepts that although Iran is for sure more sinning than sinned against in the region, so have other countries, including Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not lily-white. It is.
To look at it in the round.
You've got to look at it.
That might be a tough call with this White House.
Yeah.
Well, it might be, but as I say, if you want relative peace across the Gulf, that's the only way forward.
While we've got you here, I've got to ask you about the programme last night, Panorama. The Leader's office, Jeremy Corbyn's office, have come out fighting, declaring war on the BBC today, on those staffers, former staffers who blew the whistle. What do you make of it all?
Well, I've seen reports of the Panorama programme. I was actually at my book launch last night, so apologies for not seeing the programme, but I've seen enough of the reports, and particularly I've read in detail the Labour Party's response. I think it's pathetic.
You think the response is pathetic from the Leader's office?
I do. And what they're trying to do is to denigrate the witnesses rather than to take seriously the evidence of the witnesses, which were very, very powerful. And Tom Watson is the elected deputy leader of the Labour Party. I mean, it's come to something when the elected deputy leader of the party has said, no, the Leader's office have got this entirely wrong. They're very defensive for very good reason. They've never taken the issue seriously. I don't think all of them are anti-Semitic themselves, but what they are guilty of is at best complacency about anti-Semitism, not understanding that it is racist to be anti-Semitic towards somebody who's of the Jewish faith, as it is to be racist towards somebody who's black or Asian. And they don't get that. And critically, they conflate concern about the way the Israeli governments in recent years have treated the Palestinians, which, let me say, I and many Israeli Jews share, with into a trope against people of the Jewish faith and against the existence of Israel. And that's where Jeremy Corbyn, I think, is, and has led to this terrible...
Sort of permissive
regime, yeah.
Jack Straw, thank you very much for coming to join us.
Thank you.
Thousands of immigrants in America could be deported this weekend in high-profile raids by border agents. The White House has ordered the action as part of its bid to get tough on immigration. President Trump has spoken about deporting millions of illegal immigrants.
It now looks like the final number won't be that big. Some 2,000 people who recently got to the US illegally are expected to be rounded up in 10 major cities. The White House says it will try to keep families together in special detention centres. Let's go to San Francisco and speak to Ron Christie, former advisor, of course, to George W. Bush. Nice to see you, Ron. We've been told for weeks that the detention centres in the United States are full. So where are they going to put all these people that they round up?
Well, good evening to you both, Christian and Caddy. This is a very delicate issue for the United States. On one hand, you have facilities that are designed to handle thousands of people, and you're finding hundreds of thousands of people who are coming to our borders. And it's a really delicate issue of moving people to the interior of the United States. So you have immigrants going to places like Maine, they're going all around the United States to ease some of the tension and overcrowding that you find at the Texas and Arizona borders.
Yeah, but the other issue, isn't it, a delicate political one for the White House? When they separated families, Ron, last year, and you had all those pictures of families and kids on the borders, actually the president dipped in the approval ratings, and even Republicans said they didn't particularly like those images. Is there a risk of a backlash against the White House if they're seen to round up lots of families in a very high-profile way, which is what it seems to be that the president wants?
The term you used, Katty, I think is the appropriate one, which is delicate. The White House has a very, very narrow rope to walk on here. On one hand, they certainly don't want to separate families, but they also want to assure the American people they're doing everything that they can to have people come to the United States legally and lawfully. So the notion that you're going to separate families or look inhumane is an image that this administration does not want coming so close to an election year here in the United States, just a little more than a year away.
Okay, Ron, stay with us. I want to talk about another story that's breaking in the United States. Every 10 years, as a resident of the US, I'm asked to fill out a census form. Asked lots of questions about where I live, who's in my household, things like that. Nowhere on that form at the moment does it ask me whether or not I'm an American citizen, which, for the record, I'm not.
In the next couple of hours, Donald Trump will hold a press conference at which he's expected to say he is changing that rule for the 2020 census. His administration has already tried to add a citizenship question, but you might remember the Supreme Court blocked him just a couple of weeks ago. So now he wants to sign an executive order to get around the courts. What's interesting, Ron, is the role that William Barr, the Attorney General, is playing in this, because it seemed to me a couple of weeks ago he was saying to the Department of Justice, OK, this is a no-go, let's print the census to get on with it. And now he seems to be facilitating something which he knows the Supreme Court would probably take a dim view of.
Well, Christian, this is a very delicate issue. An issue here is whether the President of the United States has the ability to add a question asking about citizenship of those who are here being counted for the census. From a legal standpoint, I think the answer to that question is yes. What the Supreme Court held a few weeks back is that they were questioning the legitimacy of why the administration wanted to do this. In other words, the court didn't feel that they had provided an adequate really explanation as to why they wanted to put this question on. If the president acts later today, as we think that he will, via executive order, then the Supreme Court, this will be litigated again, and the administration had better have their act together and say, here is exactly why we want to have a citizen question on the census, and here's the justification for it.
Okay, Ron, which may be why ABC News is just reporting that apparently the president, and it's only ABC News in the US, but a respected broadcaster, is reporting that actually the president is going to back down and not sign an executive order putting a citizenship question in the census. I guess, Ron, you know, you're a lawyer, they have lawyers around them, they just realized this wasn't going to go anywhere in the courts.
Well, actually, Katty, I think it would have gone their way in the court, but it would have to go to the district court, it'd have to go to the Court of Appeals, and eventually the Supreme Court. As we know in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think this is something as from a political rather than legal standpoint, I think the administration didn't want to lose in the court of public opinion.
Okay. Ron Christie, stay with us 1 second. I have to show you something, Ron, and all our viewers. Earlier today, Mr. Trump took to Twitter to mock several of his potential rivals in the 2020 campaign. Could you imagine having Sleepy Joe Biden or a very nervous and skinny version of Pocahontas as your president rather than what you have now, so great looking and smart, a true stable genius? Ron, you and Christian are very fine specimens of men. I've always thought so. I'm not sure
stable.
Either of you, and well,
Ron's the genius.
Yeah, Christian is only moderately stable, but I'm never quite sure that either of you would feel the need to say in public how good looking you are.
I'll speak for myself here, Katty. I would never say such a thing, and dare say my friend Christian, I think he wouldn't do so.
Why are you laughing when you're talking about me and stable genius?
Or very good looking, for that matter.
Can we just put that tweet back up a second? If you are a stable genius, right, you have to get your fractions right. Look at this tweet. Yeah? Does anybody understand the bit in brackets?
No.
Mr. President, it is 1/1024. It is not 1024th. That is not genius.
Yeah, I'm glad that you were concentrating.
That's why I'm an English major and a lawyer.
Anyway, that was, you know, what can we say? Pure Trump, touting his geniusness and his good looks.
Those of us who have it all, we don't boast about it.
Can I just say thank you, Ron, very much. One other thing on the census that is important, I think, to mention is that statisticians don't like this citizenship question because the census is meant to be a snapshot of where the country is. Immigrants, illegal immigrants, residents, citizens, all of them. And they're worried that if they add this question about citizenship, some people just won't answer, so you're not getting a true reflection of the country.
So if you're not a citizen, do you just disappear?
Well, if you don't answer the census, you're not counted on the census.
But why would you, if you were already a minority feeling under pressure, you wouldn't answer?
No, you would not, especially if you're there illegally.
So you don't get
if you're there illegally, you wouldn't answer it exactly. That's the idea. Yeah. OK. The British Foreign Office says there's no reason to believe that Sir Kim Darroch's emails were hacked. Instead, the official inquiry is focusing attention on finding whether someone within the system deliberately leaked the British ambassador's communiques. Sir Kim resigned yesterday as the UK's ambassador to Washington after the emails were printed in a British paper.
Downing Street has refused to rule out the possibility of Theresa May identifying a new ambassador before she leaves office in just 2 weeks' time. Andrew Overton was spokesperson and deputy head of communications at the British Embassy in Washington until last year. He worked for Mr. Darroch and he is with us in the Annapolis studio. Very good to see you, Andrew. Let me ask you, if he hadn't resigned yesterday, what would Kim Darroch's legacy have been if he'd seen it all the way to the end of the year?
Thanks so much for having me today. I mean, what I'll say here is it was a wonderful, absolutely wonderful legacy. I mean, the president, I think what's really important here is that the president consistently, with these tweets, has undermined U.S. diplomacy. He's shattered norms and continues to erode our alliances with every vitriolic tweet that he sends. Personally, and I can speak for a number of my colleagues and friends in the Foreign Office, we're devastated that Sir Kim, a remarkable diplomat, a loyal civil servant, was caught in the crossfire here. He's received overwhelming support from his colleagues, and my Twitter and Facebook feeds are full of wonderful anecdotes of his remarkable leadership during his time at the British Embassy in Washington. And of course, civil servants, can point out they can't point out what's clear to everyone in Washington, that the president's thin skin and his loose relationship with the truth, which your previous segment just alluded to, is making it much harder for diplomats to do their jobs, which I think makes us all less safe.
Andrew, you were there also during the Obama administration. It's not always easy for an embassy to deal with any administration. Did you notice a particular shift in the British embassy's relationship with the White House between President Obama and President Trump? I mean, the President Trump was suggesting that he'd had a bad relationship with Sir Kim Darroch all along. Was that the case as far as you knew?
That's absolutely untrue. I mean, during the 2016 campaign, Sir Kim took the Trump administration seriously, unlike a lot of his ambassadorial counterparts in Washington. He was one of the few ambassadors at the on the Republican convention floor. And from the earliest days of the administration until this very week, he was routinely hosting Trump officials at his residence and was welcomed with open arms in the White House. I think the Trump team loved Sir Kim, and they really cared deeply about the UK relationship. So his claim that he was not well liked or well thought of, really couldn't be further from the truth.
Just a real quick one, Andrew. Did Sir Kim, when he was out and about in Washington, undermine Brexit, talk down Brexit, say it was a disaster?
No, Sir Kim's a penultimate diplomat. I mean, occasionally he would be frank with us, with our colleagues, but he absolutely did a tremendous job during some of the most difficult circumstances by recognizing, that the UK and US relationship goes kind of much deeper than its leaders and much deeper than any policy area. So he was traveling, in preparation for Brexit. He was constantly traveling outside of the Beltway, meeting with governors, CEOs of companies that invest in the UK. And he oversaw the opening of new UK offices, including in North Carolina and Minnesota. So he was laying the groundwork for what a UK-US trade relationship was going to be like after Brexit. OK, Andrew Overton, thank you very much for being with us.
I have to say, in all of my dealings with Kim, he was a real civil servant. You wouldn't have known what his politics were. He was very much representing the British government, not a political figure in Washington.
OK, on Thursday, the 11th of July, 1859, 160 years ago, Big Ben first began striking the hour. And since then, the bell, which sits at the top of the Elizabeth Tower above the Palace of Westminster, has been an enduring symbol of British democracy.
Yeah, 160 years, not entirely without incident, of course. Throughout World War II, it continued to chime, though the clock face of the tower went dark to avoid guiding the German bombers to their targets in the Blitz. In 1962 and again in 1968, heavy snow stopped the clock's hands from moving. In 2005, though, it was hot weather. And then in 2015, it was discovered that Big Ben had been running 7 seconds fast. Oh la la.
Yeah.
Actually, that's
unlike me, that runs 7 minutes slow.
Yeah.
For the past 2 years, Big Ben has been undergoing restoration work. The clock face has been dismantled. The bell is still in place. It should be completed by 2021. And while working on the tower, look what they found. A time capsule that was left in the 1950s by the workers repairing the Blitz damage. I hate to spoil the party. Can I say this? But it stopped for 4 years when it had first been installed, so it's not really been ringing for 160 years.
7 minutes late, that is what Christian usually is into the studio.
This is Beyond 100 Days from the BBC, she's not wrong.
And coming up for viewers on the BBC News Channel and BBC World News, President Trump is hosting a social media summit at the White House. But instead of the Silicon Valley giants attending, it's right-wing social media pundits and conservative lawmakers who have made the guest list. That's all coming up.
Hello. After an evening of torrential thundery downpours affecting parts of northern and eastern Scotland, they are going to fade going into the night. This area of low pressure is the culprit. That is now moving away and just coming in time for the weekend, this area of high pressure. So the storms fading, 1 or 2 showers, a few thunderstorms, parts of the Midlands into East Anglia. They will also clear away. We're left with a few showers still running into northern Scotland, but most places having a dry night. Though the thicker cloud in Northern Ireland may just start to produce a bit of patchy light rain or drizzle. Still quite muggy overnight, temperatures for many of us holding up towards the mid-teens. So for Friday, it's a sunny start for many of us. If you start with sunshine, you're going to see a bit of cloud building. If you start cloudy, you'll see a bit of sunshine coming out. And then we're waiting for a few showers to develop again. And here they start going through northern and eastern parts of Scotland, down through northern and eastern England. Very well scattered showers, perhaps some thunderstorms. Most places will avoid them and stay dry. And here are your temperatures, again, mostly towards the low 20s, a few spots approaching the mid-20s. As for Wimbledon, there is a slight chance of catching a shower over the next couple of days, not significant to show up here in the symbols. Sunday is looking dry, perhaps a little bit cooler, but these are really decent temperatures for playing and for spectating, for that matter. And here comes the area of high pressure, and that's moving right across the British Isles as we go through the weekend. Now, I don't expect clear blue sky. There will be areas of cloud, some warm sunny spells at times too, and at least during Saturday there's still a chance of catching a shower, more so perhaps towards parts of England. And the breeze is taking a little more of a track towards North Sea coast, and that will cool things a bit here. Some spots into the mid to upper teens, whereas elsewhere again many are getting towards the at least low 20s. And then for part 2 of the weekend on Sunday, again a mix of cloud and sunshine. There's a chance of catching an isolated shower somewhere, maybe a bit of patchy rain from thicker cloud too running towards the far northwest of Scotland. Still a little cooler along North Sea coast than it is elsewhere, but for many it will be a very pleasant end to the weekend. High pressure holding on for Monday, and then Tuesday for a few days looks like low pressure may get the upper hand. If you want some rain on the garden, well, there's a chance anyway of getting some showers.
Wherever you are, follow the story with BBC News. If you have a smart speaker, just ask for BBC News. Get all the news you care about by personalising your app. We're here to help you make sense of it all. Send us your questions via the hashtag BBC Ask This. Follow the story, wherever you are, with BBC News.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines, freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The Papers, weeknights at 10:40 and 11:30 on the BBC News Channel.
This may be our last chance.
I believe we should go to the moon.
The woman in mission control was a very big deal.
This was not a yellow brick road.
How risky is this flight?
7.5 million pounds of thrust.
3, 2, 1.
Chasing the Moon starts Tuesday at 8 on BBC 4.
This is Beyond 100 Days. I'm Katty Kay with Christian Fraser in London.
Our top stories. A Royal Navy frigate shadowing a tanker owned by BP steps in with protection after 3 Iranian vessels tried to block its passage. Thousands of illegal immigrants could be rounded up for deportation from America this weekend after President Trump calls for high-profile raids.
And coming up in the next half hour, a report says there is still a significant problem of bullying and harassment towards Westminster staff who work for British MPs. And flash flooding and tornadoes as a massive storm approaches New Orleans. The mayor warns that residents that they cannot pump away the water levels expected.
Donald Trump has often complained about liberal bias on social media, so today he's hosting a tech summit at the White House with some of the biggest names in conservative media.
Yeah, tweeting earlier today, the president said the summit will cover the dishonesty and bias of the fake news media, adding fake news is not as important or as powerful as social media. They have lost tremendous credibility since the election in 2016. Joining us now from Washington is Margaret O'Mara, history professor at the University of Washington and author of The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. It seems to me that the problem with this tech summit, Margaret, is that the tech companies aren't there. Can we make significant changes in social media if the social media companies aren't even at the table?
No, you can't. They're really central to the problem. I mean, with the dilemma that both Washington and Silicon Valley have on their hands is one that's only going to be solved when they come together. And the real, basic problem is that there's a regulatory regime that's governing social media that was created in an era when the internet was very different.
Margaret, the big tech companies are already under closer scrutiny than ever before in Congress. Is there a danger with them not being there and some of the senior figures from Congress in the room that some of that process could be speeded up?
Well, it's so interesting. Kind of the mood in Washington now is so dramatically different than it was just a few years ago, and really for such a long time. I mean, the ground I cover in my book is 70 years long of a relationship between the U.S. government and the U.S. tech industry, and for so long it was a very, very positive one. Leaders of both parties, presidents and members of Congress, were very gung-ho about the possibility of Silicon Valley companies to change the world, and now the mood is darkened. But again, it's going to be, regulatory fixes and legal fixes are not going to be quick and easy. They're going to need to be technologically informed and listening to the people who really understand how it works. So
there are a whole host of problems around social media. Of course, intervention in democratic elections is one of them that Congress is trying to wrestle with. Is the president right with the premise that there is a political bias inherent to social media sites, whether it's through the algorithms or whatever it is, that conservative voices are excluded from social media platforms?
Well, the great irony about this bias conversation is that actually the problem stems from the fact that the social media platforms have been designed to try and be neutral. This really goes back to kind of the philosophy with which the platforms have been designed by Silicon Valley denizens at the beginning, that you're going to create this platform for free and open communication. You're not going to have gatekeepers who are deciding who's saying what and who has a privileged voice. But of course, these platforms have been designed for maximum engagement. They draw us in because they appeal to our emotions, whether it be something that's a positive emotion or an angry emotion. And of course, that is what social media platforms have become very very good conveyances for all sorts of speech that their creators didn't imagine.
Yeah, from which Donald Trump has, of course, profited more than most. Let me ask you about something that's happened this side. The French government today has approved a law, or the Parliament has, that would make France the first major economy to impose a tax on these internet giants. So I think it's a 3% tax. How will the United States react to that? What will it mean for these social media giants?
It's very interesting because this question of the sort of the specialness of the internet is something that is being reckoned with both in the U.S. and globally. I mean, it reminds, the question of whether internet commerce should be taxed, of course, was a live one in the United States for a very long time, and now you do have you buy something on the internet in the U.S. and it is subject to state tax in the way you didn't used to be. And these internet giants have grown large in an era in the United States when taxation has been very low. There's been a swing towards deregulation, lowering taxes, so much so that some of these very, very large companies don't pay much in tax at all. And that is contributing to the problem. It's making government have fewer resources, at least the U.S. government, to be a countervailing force to the growth of not just the tech industry, but industry in general.
Margaret O'Mara in Washington, good to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed. The Labour Party has denounced whistleblowers who spoke to last night's BBC Panorama programme about alleged anti-Semitism. Labour says the former party officials were disaffected opponents of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, we heard Jack Straw talk about this earlier on in the programme. The whistleblowers had claimed that close associates of Mr Corbyn interfered in the way that the party dealt with claims of anti-Semitism. The Deputy Labour leader, Tom Watson, says he's shocked, chilled and appalled by the allegations in the programme. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, has more.
The more Jeremy Corbyn's criticised, the louder the defence. This neighbour's verdicts on the media, they don't stop bullying. He's saying nothing about the latest claims that under his leadership, Labour has been soft on anti-Semitism. His close ally came out fighting. Whistleblowers' accounts of anti-Semitism had been distorted, their claims disputed by colleagues.
Some serious charges there. They've been hotly contested. Some of the ex-staff statements have been contested by existing staff. There's been complaints put into the BBC now, and I think the BBC should investigate those and then we can come to a conclusion.
Has the Labour Party leadership done enough to tackle anti-Semitism?
I think it has. I've always said at the very beginning it was too slow, not ruthless enough, and I think that's improved dramatically.
But last night's Panorama has inflamed the row over anti-Semitism with striking testimony from whistleblowers.
And they might not call me a dirty Jew, but they'll call me a dirty Zionist.
I do not think the Labour Party is a safe space for Jewish people anymore.
But Mr Corbyn's deputy is denying whistleblowers were politically motivated, demanding automatic expulsions and an independent complaints body.
I was shocked when I saw Panorama last night, and I'm angry this morning. The only way to deal with this is to address action, not words. This is about practice and culture. It must have taken great courage for them to whistleblow, and for them to have to call out poor practices, I think, is deeply sad and actually deplorable that we would just dismiss them as in some way sort of disaffected.
This row's also getting personal. Mr Corbyn's close advisor, Seamus Milne, is accused of improper interference in discipline cases. So's Party General Secretary Jenny Formby. Labour's official statement backs them up and condemns the BBC for what it calls an overtly biased intervention. Time and again, Labour's tried to damp down this row, but it's only ever grown worse. I'm told many more whistleblowers have submitted evidence to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission investigation into cases of anti-Semitism, and the deputy leader is demanding access to the party's submission to that inquiry. This is hurting Labour, and the pain can only now become worse. John Pienaar, BBC News.
So on the face of it, a job in Britain's Westminster Parliament ought to offer a great career break with great prospects for the future. But what if it comes with an unacceptable risk of bullying and harassment, and sexual harassment at that? A new report says that this is what people who work in Parliament face.
According to Gemma White, QC, her report, some staff who work for British MPs suffer a constant drip of demeaning, humiliating behaviour.
One witness told her sexual harassment is just something young working class people have to tolerate. Another said, I would never dream of lodging a complaint. I want a career.
Others say bullying and harassment come from large numbers of men and women of all ages and all levels of seniority. The report recommends that former members of staff with grievances should be allowed to make historical complaints against members of Parliament. We've been speaking to the BBC's political reporter, Jessica Parker. Jessica, Gemma White QC seems to be drilling down into the oddity of the employment situation in Westminster. So these people work for MPs, but they are paid for by us, the taxpayer.
Yes, that's right. But she sort of describes this as a system of 650 small businesses. Of course, there are 650 MPs in total, and one of the things she recommends needs to happen is a properly resourced department to oversee employment practices in MPs' offices. And I think there is a general sense that over the road in the House of Commons and indeed the House of Lords, it isn't necessarily a particularly conventional employment setup as you might see in various offices across the country, that things are based in rather arcane procedures and employment practices, and she says these things need to be updated and overseen properly. As you say, a rather unique power relationship potentially between MPs and their staff.
Jessica, are members shocked by the findings of this report? I mean, you go through it and the accounts that are being given of incidents of sexual harassment, abuse, they're incredibly graphic. Are people there shocked?
Are people shocked? I wouldn't necessarily say totally shocked. We have heard allegations swirling around of bullying and harassment before, as you guys will know. I think, though, some of the details, as you say, will shock some people for sure. The report outlines that the most common form of offending behaviour is when MPs shout, demean, belittle and humiliate their staff on a regular basis, often in public. And it adds as well, sexual harassment is also a problem. So of course these findings will shock some people, but as I say, we've heard reports around these things before, so perhaps the fact that this inquiry is even happening to begin with suggests that people were maybe already aware that there was some kind of problem.
Yeah. The Lords had a similar report that was published yesterday, similar behaviour among the peers as well. Some of the solutions that they suggested was to put CCTV cameras in the bars and the public spaces where staff and MPs and peers interact, as if they can't be trusted to be all together in a public place.
I think what you have overall is a determination on the authorities' behalf to look as though they are trying to address this problem. That is why we have had two inquiries, one in the House of Lords, one in the House of Commons, with a number of recommendations. It'll be interesting to see whether those recommendations are indeed acted on. It is important, of course, that where laws are made, where taxpayers are funding the Houses of Parliament, that proper standards are upheld, but also stressing that it isn't unusual in other workplaces outside of Parliament for these kinds of problems to arise.
OK, Jessica Parker, thanks very much.
Interesting, isn't it, that Jessica, who works in Millbank and is around that sort of atmosphere and sees it and hears the gossip around the village, isn't shocked by what's in that report, yet you and I read that and the sort of things that were being discussed.
My jaw was on the floor. It was some of the graphicness of them. We took out some of the most graphic quotes that the QC got about the types of sexual harassment that are happening. And you kind of think if they're beyond being shocked, when they read it in black and white that this is happening to people, then you have a real problem. They have to be able to read that and have the empathy.
We should remember a lot of these interns are young people.
Young people who are desperate to get ahead in their careers, have very vulnerable positions and are being picked on, preyed on, really.
Yeah. Severe weather conditions in the US state of Louisiana at the moment, with forecasters warning of hurricane-force winds before the end of the week. Authorities issued a flash flood emergency in the New Orleans area. Streets, homes, hotel lobbies flooded in a severe thunderstorm. Meteorologists say around 8 inches of rain fell in about 2 hours. Look at that. The weather system also threw up this water spout.
Wow.
That's quite a water spout, isn't it? Sucking up liquid from the nearby lake Pontchartrain in a tornado-like manner, and this footage was filmed from the safety of a neighbouring office. We're told there are no reports of the water spout causing any injuries.
Yeah, the Mayor of New Orleans, LaToya Cantrell, has warned residents that they could expect more from this tropical storm.
We do expect that this storm will be slow moving. What that means is that there is a possibility, as it's moving slow, that we're going to get heavy rainfall for up to 48 hours it could be. 48 hours, potential rainfall, consistent rainfall over the city of New Orleans.
Yeah, difficult to deal with that amount of water. Southeast of New Orleans, officials have ordered mandatory evacuations. Manuel Bojorquez, I think I've pronounced that right, Bojorquez, is in New Orleans for CBS News and sent this update.
Those mandatory evacuations are happening in low-lying parishes south of New Orleans. But here in the city, all eyes are on the Mississippi River, and here's why. Flooding along the nation's midsection has sent a lot of water downstream, so the river is already swollen. That, coupled with the potential storm surge from the tropical system and the additional rain, could spell trouble. Officials have said they believe the levees that protect the city, like the one we are on, will hold during the event, but they fear that the water could overtop some of them. So while there is still uncertainty in the track of that tropical system, they're urging everyone here to be prepared. Manuel Bojorquez, CBS News for BBC News, New Orleans.
And of course, everyone who remembers Hurricane Katrina is going to be very sensitive to all of that rain and the strength of the levees down there in New Orleans. Larison Campbell is a political reporter in Mississippi whose task of covering a Republican politician got a lot harder when he said she couldn't accompany him on a campaign trip unless she brought along a male chaperone. Apparently, Robert Foster, who wants to be the state's next governor, was so nervous about being seen on the trail with a woman, even a woman journalist, that he insisted that Ms. Campbell find a male colleague to bring with her.
His campaign told her they were worried that if somebody happened to take a photo of the journalist with the candidate, it could be used by his political rivals to slander him. Her newspaper, Mississippi Today, said it was a waste of newsroom resources to send along an extra journalist to effectively babysit Miss Campbell. And Miss Campbell, who is with us, is a grown-up. I probably didn't need a chaperone, am I right?
I would say so. Thank you.
Tell us what your editor said when you told your editor, him or her, what had been said to you.
Well, you know, it was a couple of conversations that I had with Colton Robinson, the campaign manager. And the first one, you know, we actually set up the interview for today. It was going to be a 15-hour ride along. I was very excited to kind of get that campaign access. And then at the very end of the conversation, he threw this caveat, you know, we need you to bring a male colleague along. And so I did take it to my editor, and I was like, this seems blatantly sexist, and he agreed. And so I went back to him and I said, look, like, we can't do this here. Like, you know, it's kind of a far-fetched request, but we'd still love to make this interview work. How do we do this? And they weren't really comfortable with any sort of wiggle room. And, you know, I certainly was not comfortable with that requirement. So the interview fell apart.
So, Larison, Mississippi is a fairly conservative state. Is it common for male politicians to feel that they can't be seen alone in the company of a woman in the state, even a woman reporter?
I have to be honest with you, it is a very conservative state. This is absolutely the first time I've heard of anything like this happening here. You know, but, you know, there are different levels that do make it sort of interesting to report on politics as a woman in Mississippi. My female colleagues and I, you know, talk about the differences between how we're sort of treated on the campaign trail or in the halls of the state capitol versus the way our male colleagues are. So, you know, this particular request was a shock, but I'm not sure I can actually call it a total surprise.
Okay, so what I was just wondering is, this has been picked up, this story, and is being reported. It's being reported here on the BBC and, of course, in the United States as well. Has the Foster campaign come back with any kind of perhaps retraction, decided it's fine for you to come along? What's their reaction been?
Oh, no. I think they're they are very happy with the way they've positioned things, I think. You know, he's kind of doubled down. He said, you know, when I spoke to his campaign manager, it was sort of, well, we're worried about, you know, trackers who are people who kind of, you know, try to get sort of launch smear campaigns. And he was like, we're worried about, you know, somebody doing that. And now, you know, they've actually come back with this whole story about the Billy Graham rule and this pact that the candidate has with his wife and, you know, never being alone with a woman. And I mean, first, it's the first I've heard of all of that, but, you know, I think it's a message that is really resonating with a lot of his supporters. Certainly, a lot of people think that his request was weird, including his campaign manager, who actually called it a weird request when he first called me about it. But, you know, a lot of other people out there are really excited that he has taken this stand.
Okay, Larison Campbell, it is hard enough being a political reporter anyway. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you managed to be able to just get to do your job.
Can I put the alternative view, devil's advocate?
Go on.
All right, so some teachers now go into classrooms with female teachers, some doctors go into doctor's surgeries with nurses. Is this the inevitable pushback to Me Too?
No, because when you go into a doctor's surgery, there is a chance that you're getting partially undressed in order to have an examination. When you're out on the campaign trail, you are just doing the job of a reporter and asking questions. So no comparison. This is Beyond 100 Days and still to come. It's not the most popular sport, but what we show what it looks like. I promise you this is coming up. I'm not even going to say anything more. It's coming.
Tons of plastic are being removed from a riverbed in Cumbria. The plastic was put there to protect the river 20 years ago.
Yeah, but now that plastic is being eroded and fragments of it are being washed away into the sea. The BBC's Alison Freeman has more.
At first glance, the River Kekul looks like any other. But take a closer look and you can see its dark secret. Reams and reams of black plastic. This plastic was used to line the river to protect it from contamination from a nearby disused mine. But over the past 2 decades, it's deteriorated and it's become the pollutant itself, as well as an eyesore.
There's been such a knee-jerk reaction, or the worry about what the river will do once the coal mining operations had finished. It was a natural thing. Let's just constrain the river, put it in plastic, and then we can walk away and it'll be fine. Well, in only 20 years, that plastic's starting to degrade. We've got to try and remember that, is that we're not just taking plastic out of a river, rivers go to the sea, so this potentially would end up in the sea.
What's happening here is thought to be the biggest river restoration of its kind in the UK. This summer's project is a pilot, with plastic being cleared from a 200-metre stretch. Next year, the rest of the 2.5 kilometres will be restored, costing more than £1 million. It'll benefit wildlife as well as people. Catherine and her family live nearby. They welcome the project.
The benefit of getting this back to nature for us as a community is that we'll be able to spend more time here safely, and we'll be able to enjoy more wildlife, because when the river is restored, obviously the wildlife that lives in it will be increased as well. It'll be a better habitat, a more natural habitat for the wildlife.
More rivers have been renaturalised in Cumbria than anywhere else in the UK, but the Kekul is the most challenging by far. Alison Freeman, BBC News.
Can you see that I'm smiling?
I know what's coming.
For the first time since 1992, England are through to a World Cup final. Yes, you heard that right. England and our cricketers are into the World Cup final. They thrashed Australia today at Edgbaston by 8 wickets. Australia bowled out for 223, 3 wickets for Wokes and Rashid, 2 for Archer, and a superb 85
you carry
from
on
Jason
reading,
Roy.
I know this is making
I just know we've got a lot of producers upstairs who are from Australia.
Carry on.
Which means they will play New Zealand on Sunday at Lord's. England will play New Zealand at Lord's on Sunday. I will be mostly indoors.
Okay.
The phone will be off the hook. The curtains will be drawn.
Yeah. Let's just watch.
Cricket's coming home was the chant from the England fans as they left Edgbaston, having watched their side thump their old rivals Australia by 8 wickets to book their place in the World Cup final on Sunday against New Zealand at Lord's. Australia won the toss. It looked a really good toss to win early on this morning because they put themselves into bat, but regrettably, they might not be thinking that that was the right thing to do. They were 14 for 3, having lost the early wickets of Aaron Finch, their captain for a golden duck. David Warner went cheaply, as did Peter Hanscom, who was in for a World Cup debut. Then they had Steve Smith get them into some sort of position to put up some sort of fight against England. He was the only Australian batsman to go past 50, eventually run out for 85 runs, and the Australia tail went pretty cheaply as Adil Rashid and Chris Wokes both finished with 3 wickets, and there was some decent bowling as well from Jofra Archer. So 224 was the target for England, and they knocked it off very comfortably. Their opening partnership, 124 between Johnny Bairstow and Jason Roy. Johnny Bairstow eventually going for LBW plum, bowled by Mitchell Stark, which he reviewed, and that meant that England were out of reviews when Jason Roy really needed one, because Pat Cummins bowled, caught behind, he didn't get anything on it, it was given out, and he was on his way back to the pavilion. That wasn't to matter. Owen Morgan, the one-day captain, and Joe Root, the test captain, saw England over the line, with Morgan hitting the winning runs to put England into that showpiece finale against New Zealand. England have been to 3 World Cup finals before. They've lost all 3 of them. The last one back in 1992 when they beat South Africa in Sydney to get to the final against Pakistan. That wasn't to be for England. 27 years on, they've certainly put the semi-final hoodoo that's been over England this summer and last summer to bed. And England, can they go to Lord's and get their hands on the World Cup trophy?
Yes. One of the other great contests that has been decided at Emerald Downs in Washington this weekend, the T-Rex Dash. This was the 3rd annual race, where every competitor is obliged to wear the exact same inflatable Tyrannosaurus Rex costume. Look at them running with their heads held high.
It's the way, okay, it's the way
Look
their
at that.
heads wobble slightly off to the edge.
It's the technique. Look at that.
It's the technique. This, because we like to bring you occasionally random animal stories, this may be the most random, most animal,
This is
most
the 3rd
story
year of the T-Rex race, so popular that they had to put 2 to every stall to get them all in.
This is a track, by the way, where they
what's
have...
that one? What's happened there?
It's become deflated. What happens to a T-Rex when it gets a puncture? It becomes...
There's no prizes, there's no prize money. It's just for laughs.
I'll be back in Washington next week.
Well, it's
Sorry,
nice to have you
I can't
back. Nice
it's
of you
good.
to turn up. Yeah,
I'll
where have
speak
you
to
been?
Next week from Washington. I've been on holiday. But next week I'll be with
We'll
you
be in the
from
right
Washington.
boxes next week.
Yeah. Panic over.